people on the planet. The conflict, like the COVID-19 pandemic that preceded it, has once again laid bare the downside of global interdependence. This session provides a unique opportunity to take stock of this situation. Let us be honest and unbiased in answering two questions. The answers to them, as well as the ensuing necessary steps to take, is what all people around the globe expect from us, the UN member states. First, what were the root causes of the conflict in Ukraine? Second, what needs to be done to stop that conflict and prevent anything similar from recurring? Mr. President, we are convinced that the conflict in Ukraine stems from a wider geopolitical chaos. Its causes must be sought in the events that took place 30 years ago. History teaches us that epoch-making wars that end with unfair and humiliating peace terms contain the seeds of future conflicts. Let us take a look at what kind of peace was established after the end of the last epoch-making confrontation, the Cold War. Apparently, the so-called winners, under the effects of the euphoria, did not deem it necessary to draw on examples from the past. They could have followed the path of Alexander I, Metternich, and Castlereagh. These great peacemakers of the early 19th century effectively integrated their adversary into a new security system. In so doing, they brought a lasting peace to Europe that would endure for decades to come. They could have also drawn inspiration from the cooperation established in World War II by the Big Three, Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill. They forged arrangements that significantly decreased the chances for great powers to wage wars against each other. Unfortunately, despite that, the Western policymakers of the early 1990s chose the most inglorious and most unpromising option, namely the path of the 1919-style Versailles diplomats keen on trampling upon their main opponent. To begin with, the Cold War ended not even with an official treaty, but with some sort of gentlemen's agreements and declarations. Subsequent events revealed that these arrangements were not respected by the winning side. In fact, the arrangements were nothing more than a Versailles 2.0. The West selfishly offered the post-Soviet states only a single path, that of becoming its satellites. To cement that status, the West relied on the expansion of one of its key Cold War-era institutions, the military bloc of NATO. NATO expanded eastward. This happened despite the agreements achieved with the West, including agreements made with Soviet leaders. The West overlooked the legitimate security interests of both Russia and Belarus. In this regard, I wish to recall an outstanding American diplomat, George Kennan. His foreign policy prophecies are so much admired by Western policymakers. But why did they fail to heed another one of Kennan's famous warnings when, in 1996, Kennan condemned the expansion of NATO as a strategic mistake of potentially epic proportions? With its drive to enlarge NATO, the West has essentially trampled underfoot the indivisibility of security, which is a vital principle that says that one party must not seek to achieve its own security at the expense of that of other parties. This logic was understood very well in the negotiators in 1815 and 1945. But the world leaders in 1919 and in 1991 refused to consider it. NATO's involvement in the illegal wars in Yugoslavia, Iraq, Libya, and Syria, in addition to the alliance's attempts to encroach on some historical Eastern Slavic lands and others, made it a foregone conclusion that Versailles 2.0 would suffer the fate of the first Versailles. Therefore, the ongoing bloodshed in Ukraine is something that the collective West fully bears the blame for. It was precisely the West that made this conflict inevitable, not only through its decision to expand NATO, but also by its refusal to consider the proposals of its opponents. And there were such proposals, after all. The question arises, what should be done? Indeed, in 2009, Russia invited all interested parties to sign a new European Security Treaty. This treaty would, in essence, de jure, conclude the Cold War. The West rejected that proposal. In 2017, it was the president of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, who came up with the initiative of holding a global security dialogue. He proposed Minsk as a venue for negotiations. The opponents ignored this initiative as well. In December of last year, the Russian Federation made yet another attempt to reach an agreement with the West on the matter of European security. As before, the West remained deaf to the new Russian proposal. What explains this rejectionist stance by the West? The key problem is that there is an ongoing clash at the global level, a clash of two incompatible visions of the world order, namely the concentric and the polycentric visions. The West wants to establish a concentric or a unipolar world. It is a world ruled from one center and subordinated to the interests of a Western hegemon. Most other countries wish to create a polycentric or multipolar world with no single center of control, in which no one imposes its visions, interests, or values on anyone else. The West dominated the world over the last 5 centuries and believes that it can continue this indefinitely. However, we are deeply convinced that the world has changed and that neocolonialism, whatever its form may be, is no longer acceptable or viable. 5 centuries ago, the West was just beginning its global ascent. The world came to witness at that point the Copernican revolution of knowledge. This took place first and foremost in the minds of people at that time. They found it difficult to come to terms with the postulate that it was not the Earth but the Sun that stood at the center of the solar system. A similar Copernican paradigm shift needs to occur today. As was the case half a millennium ago, it must take place in people's minds too. This time around, it must occur in the minds of the West's political mainstream. The West must finally realize a number of truths. Number 1, international relations do not revolve around one single source of power, namely the Western center of power. Second, the world's history has no end because it is not an inexorable movement of all countries toward what's known as liberal democracy. Third, the world is too complex of a structure to reduce all of its problems to a confrontation, as we've heard from this rostrum too, a confrontation between the so-called democracies and autocracies. It seems that this sort of realization is not in evidence. What we have seen instead is a destruction stubbornly pursued by the West, including self-destruction. Today, economic sanctions are almost the only tool in the West's foreign policy toolkit. An impression arises that for Europe and the United States, the indicator of the effectiveness of sanctions is the very fact that they've been introduced. And in this regard, we see a substitution of concepts. The key objective has not been achieved, whereas the sanctions keep living a life of their own. What common sense does the West invest in economic sanctions it imposes against other countries? Without any trace of hesitation, the goal has been stated loud and clear. The aim is to achieve a change of power in various countries through food riots that will emerge as a result of sanctions. This calculation has largely turned out to be a failure. Most countries have not joined the sanctions. Many states under sanctions, such as Belarus and Russia, are largely self-sufficient. Importantly, the sanctions have given us a powerful impetus to develop hidden internal reserves and to reinvigorate regional integration. So there's no doubt that we will weather the storm. In the same way as the freedom-loving Cuba has been surviving illegal sanctions for over 6 decades. But these sanctions have had two negative implications. Their sponsors could hardly have foreseen those. First, they reduced the supply of fertilizers and food from the countries under sanctions. The result of this is that the poorest people in developing countries are suffering from it. Suffice it to say that the prices in these countries over the last half year have increased by 300%. And there is a fertilizer shortage of over 2 million tons. Secondly, the sanctions have had a boomerang effect, hitting the West itself. No matter how some may swagger today, ordinary people in Europe, unfortunately, will have to freeze through the upcoming winter. It's high time for Western countries to resort to common sense and return to dialogue and cooperation. Even in this current situation, Belarus stands ready to embrace dialogue and cooperation on equal terms without any preconditions or pressure. Mr. President, Belarus has spoken a lot everywhere about the conflict in Ukraine, as many other countries have done. We cannot do otherwise. This conflict is happening at our very doorstep. We're very sad to witness how the fraternal Ukrainian people has fallen victim to the collective West's geopolitical games. We are convinced that the origins of Ukraine's specific problems should be sought in 2004, when the West managed to carry out the first color revolution in this country. The Orange Revolution, a decade later, firmly secured the status for Ukraine as an anti-Russia. Instigated by the United States and their allies, for 8 years, Ukraine has been exterminating the people of Donbass for no other reason than that the local people want to speak their native language, Russian. But the West does not need Ukraine, neither as a member of NATO or as a member of the European Union. Its new patrons are simply using it for their own great game against Russia. Today, Ukraine is paying the price in blood because its politicians bought into this deception, disregarding the historical brotherhood of the three East Slavic peoples, Belarusians, Russians, and Ukrainians. But it is never too late to admit and to correct one's mistakes. For Belarus, which itself went through the genocide of the Belarusian people during the Second World War, it is unbearably painful to see the chaos in our neighboring country and the suffering of ordinary Ukrainians. Ever since 2014, we have continued to make every possible effort to bring peace to Ukraine. It was our country in particular that became associated with peace in Donbass when the Minsk agreements were adopted in 2014 and 2015, right after the outbreak of hostilities in Ukraine last February. It was the president of Belarus in particular who managed to get the parties to the conflict to sit down at a negotiating table. Again, this was on Belarus soil. Belarus hosted 3 successful rounds of Ukrainian-Russian negotiations. These opened up real prospects for settling the conflict. Regrettably, this process has since stalled. We remain deeply convinced that both a ceasefire agreement and a comprehensive strategic peace settlement around Ukraine, in a broad context of regional and global security, can be achieved only at the negotiating table. There is no alternative to talks. Otherwise, all of us will get a new third Versailles. As a neighbor and an affected country, Belarus should be an integral part of the negotiation process and the final security guarantees. Mr. President, we very much hope that the tragic events in Ukraine will compel the collective West to realize rather quickly that changes in international relations need to happen are irreversible. In fact, the sooner this happens, the sooner peace can be brought to Ukraine and other hot spots, and the sooner we can lay the foundation to forge a new, just world order. As a crucial step in this process, the global security dialogue in the true spirit of San Francisco is needed in our view, which the president of Belarus clearly stated as far back as 5 years ago. We have consistently highlighted the key role of great powers in this effort. Yet, unfortunately, we see today that apparently they are hearing and understanding one another rather poorly. There's not the slightest hint that they're ready to move away from recriminations. Perhaps the time has come for the countries representing the developing world to collectively take on the lead in global security with all of the energy and dynamism they displayed with such great success nearly half a century ago in advancing the idea of a new international economic order. We believe that precisely now, the non-aligned movement and BRICS, as well as the regional integration unions, are on the rise, and they need to get involved directly in matters of global peace. Yes, it's true that today, unfortunately, we do not have a clear concept on safeguarding peace and security of our planet, because the world has become so complex that a multitude of diverse challenges defy any one single framework. What is more, the mechanisms for neutralizing these global challenges that were put in place in the context of the preceding geopolitical realities are lagging behind or stalling altogether. The task facing humanity today is to ensure that our civilization moves toward a new multipolar world order without being destroyed. This is exactly what the priority must be for our common actions at the United Nations. It is in this direction, provided we want to survive at all, where we must seek consensus and promptly forge new adequate response mechanisms. It is for the sake of this objection that we must stop mutually destructive rhetoric and put an end to the fatal total confrontation that leaves no room for diplomatic efforts. But this can be done only by responsible world leaders who, to use the figurative expression of Henry Kissinger, have a sense of direction and mission. And leaders with these qualities are bound to emerge on the world stage. Our present state of mind was well captured by Martin Luther King over half a century ago. He said, quote, "We are now faced with the fact that tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now in unfolding life in history. There is no such thing as being too late. Let us act, lest it become too late." Belarus, for its part, stands ready to play the role of a vigorously committed and responsible stakeholder in security processes at the global and regional levels alike. Thank you for your attention.